But we start with the story that we first brought you over 2 years ago and which has taken a dramatic turn in the last few days, the origins of COVID. Evening, everyone, and welcome to The Next Revolution live from New York tonight. On Wednesday, the new House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic will hold its first hearing focused on the origins of COVID. Millions dead around the world, trillions of dollars spent racking up debts that will hobble us for generations. So much pain and suffering. I don't know how many times I have to say this before people in politics, the media, understand the point. Yes, Wuhan, China was where the crime took place, but the crime was not committed by China. Of course, hold them accountable for letting the virus escape, and yes, hold them accountable for the cover-up. But the central question we must face is this. What leaked from the Wuhan lab? Why was it there? And as we answer that question, which we were the first to do in January 2021, as you know, we inevitably come to the conclusion, based on the available evidence, that this was not the China virus. If anything, it was the Fauci virus, designed and built with your money. Establishing that is not some kind of political or personal vendetta. It is about doing all we can to make sure it doesn't happen again. That's why we have to start by saying unequivocally it is the US government, not just the Chinese regime, that must be held accountable for causing the pandemic. And to be clear, not the entire US government, but rogue elements who broke the rules put in place by both the Obama and Trump administrations and commissioned the reckless gain-of-function research, which is still the only plausible explanation for the origin of the COVID virus. To be specific, these men must be held accountable. Former head of the NIAID, Anthony Fauci, and former director of the NIH, Francis Collins, the leading global advocates of gain-of-function virus research for over a decade. In 2011, they wrote, quote, "Generating a potentially dangerous virus in the laboratory is a risk worth taking." Well, they took that risk, and it looks like the worst global pandemic for a century was the result. Tonight, as these vital congressional investigations get underway, we will lay out once again the evidence pointing to the Fauci experiments as the origin of COVID and show you for the first time a document from within the NIH itself that is all but an admission of guilt. Let's start with the simplest part. Within the last week, the two agencies of our government with the greatest expertise in the precise science required to make a judgment have both confirmed their view that the virus did most likely leak from the Wuhan lab. First, the Energy Department, which includes the national laboratories, basing their assessment on new intelligence. And then this from the director of the FBI, which, he reminded us, has
professionals, analysts, virologists, microbiologists, etc., who focus specifically on the dangers of biological threats, which include things like novel viruses like COVID, and the concerns that in the wrong hands, some bad guys, a hostile nation state, a terrorist, a criminal, the threats that those could pose.
And what was their conclusion?
The FBI has for quite some time now assessed that the origins of the pandemic are most likely a potential lab incident in Wuhan.
Of course, we're still waiting for our apology from all those who derided this as a far-right conspiracy theory when we first laid it out over 2 years ago.
The far right has now found its own virus conspiracy theory.
A conspiracy theory going around that the coronavirus originated and was perhaps man-made inside a lab in China.
This question about the Wuhan lab, we know that it's been debunked that this virus was man-made or modified or anything like that.
He's also pushing U.S. intelligence to find evidence for this theory that the virus was accidentally released from a lab in Wuhan. That's his new angle to feed the wingnuts, to treat this virus like it was a conspiracy of some kind.
A lot of people on the right love that phrase, escape from the lab, because it sounds like something from a Marvel movie or a comic book. Both scientists and the U.S. intelligence community agree that this coronavirus was not man-made. That is not a possibility.
Oh, that is not a possibility. Hilarious how confidently these people can be so completely wrong. There was one brave heretic who spoke out against the groupthink.
There's a novel respiratory coronavirus overtaking Wuhan, China. What do? Oh, you know who we could ask? The Wuhan novel respiratory coronavirus lab.
The amazing thing was, someone did ask them in June 2020, the virologist who was actually in charge of bat coronavirus research in Wuhan, Xi Zhengli, literally known as the Batwoman, said in an interview that her first thought when the outbreak began was that it might have come from her lab. She knew what they were working on. They'd been commissioned by Dr. Fauci's NIAID through the now notorious intermediary Peter Daszak's EcoHealth Alliance to analyze bat coronaviruses and sequence their genetic information. The aim, following the first SARS outbreak in 2002, was to try to spot where the next outbreak might come from. But they weren't just collecting and analyzing, they were also building chimeras, genetically engineered new viruses. They then infected human cells with these chimeras and showed that their man-made viruses could replicate as a functional virus. Here's the central point. The original viruses were transmitted through direct contact. The gain-of-function work they were carrying out was designed to make them airborne, more transmissible. And according to their own progress reports, they succeeded. Then, in the autumn of 2019, according to US intelligence, 3 researchers from the Wuhan lab fell ill with COVID-like symptoms and were hospitalized as a result. The autumn of 2019. Oh, I wonder what happened next. Soon after the Wuhan outbreak was confirmed and the genetic sequence of the virus was published, this bombshell email was written by virologist Christian Anderson to Dr. Fauci. Quote, "Some of the features potentially look engineered." He went on to say that he and colleagues who'd been discussing it, quote, "find the genome inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory." As we now know from emails obtained through Freedom of Information requests, Fauci, Collins and others deeply implicated in gain-of-function research, like the UK's Sir Jeremy Farrar, now unbelievably chief scientist at the WHO, went into a complete panic. And so began a monumental cover-up, kicked off by this ludicrous letter to The Lancet in February 2020, which we later learned was organised by none other than Peter Daszak himself, who was Fauci's go-between with the Wuhan lab. And then this now utterly discredited paper, published the following month in the journal Nature Medicine. To swallow the natural origin theory these people were pushing, you'd have to believe in a laughably implausible set of coincidences. Multiple different species of bats in South China, where they live, would have had to infect each other and some other unknown animal. Then either these animals or an infected human would need to have travelled 1,000 miles without infecting anyone until they got to Wuhan. The virus, in its first incarnation before any mutations, would have been 10 to 20 times more infectious than any previously observed virus occurring in nature. And most incredibly of all, the infected animal or human would have somehow chosen to make their 1,000-mile trek to the only place in all of China with a lab that had the world's most extensive collection of the viruses it was already infected with, and the one place in the entire world that carried out genetic research which matched that virus. For 3 years, they've been desperately trying to find the animal host that would make natural origin plausible. Despite testing hundreds of species, over 80,000 animal samples, nothing, no animal has been found that was infected with COVID before the first human case. There is no actual evidence at all that supports a theory of natural origin. On top of that, and since our original investigation, we now have the results of the Department of Health and Human Services Inspector General's report into the exact research projects that we identified as being the most likely cause of the pandemic. The report revealed that in May 2016, the NIAID looked at the initial progress reports from EcoHealth on its experiments in Wuhan and determined, quote, that the research could be gain of function, something that Fauci categorically ruled out. His own agency had been saying for years that gain of function could be going on in Wuhan, but Fauci denied it to Congress under oath. That is a crime right there. The IG report then detailed multiple oversight failures by EcoHealth, including overdue progress reports which prevented the opportunity to see whether, quote, new biosafety measures should be enacted. The IG report concluded, with improved oversight, NIH may have been able to take more timely corrective actions to mitigate the inherent risks associated with this type of research. In plain English, they could have prevented a global pandemic, but they didn't. Amazingly, despite all this evidence, despite the national laboratories, the FBI assessments, the NIH is still clinging to its preposterous denials. Here's that NIH document we're showing you for the first time tonight. They state that the viruses from NIH-funded research, quote, could not possibly have been the source of the pandemic. Could not possibly. That tells you right away, this is a political document, you might say an arse-covering document, not a scientific one. If you talk to people who actually know about molecular virology, they'll tell you that the entire defense mounted here is laughable. In fact, it pretty much confirms everything we've been saying. The NIH produced this chart, a kind of family tree for the pandemic virus and the viruses they experimented on. All the blue bats on the left, they're the ones they claim were studied under the NIH program. Look how distant they are from the pandemic virus, the one all the way over there on the right, with the red human form next to it. But wait, what are those pink bats also over there on the right? Actually very close to the pandemic virus. One of them is labeled RATG13. Ring any bells? It will if you were watching this show on Sunday, January the 31st, 2021. Last year, the Wuhan Institute published a paper saying that the pandemic virus was very similar to one they had in their library, RATG13. They said they just found it. But if you run that sequence through GenBank, a kind of genetic database, there's exactly one 100% match, BTCOV4991, the virus they found years before, the one from the mine, the only one out of the 152 that related to a new strain of SARS. Why didn't they reveal that? Why did they change the name? It's the closest known bat virus to the pandemic virus. The NIH is trying to claim that somehow the work they commissioned only used the blue bat viruses in the Wuhan lab and never touched the pink bat virus that was also in the lab. A virus that at that point was not airborne and therefore was the perfect match for the aims set out in the NIH project proposals. But no, they didn't touch that virus, obviously, just left it sitting there in the pink bat virus cabinet. What a joke. As if all that's not damning enough. In 2018, EcoHealth Alliance applied to the Defense Department's DARPA agency to fund another bat coronavirus project that outlined in precise detail the exact gain-of-function techniques that would explain the unusual features of the pandemic virus. Again, talk to people who work in this field. They will tell you how these grant proposals work. You apply for funding for work you've already started, work you know you can finish. This is what they were doing in Wuhan. Worse still, according to some experts, they could only have done it with the active involvement of NIH scientists. They wouldn't even have been able to design these experiments themselves. No one is saying that Dr. Fauci or anyone else unleashed the pandemic on purpose. Fauci has dedicated his life to fighting disease. But there is now very little doubt that one of his weapons of choice in that fight did lead to the pandemic. And actually, that wasn't an unthinkable accident. He was warned it could happen, not only warned, but explicitly told to stop this kind of research. But he did it anyway. For that, he must be held accountable, not because anyone's out to get Fauci, but because, as even the New York Times explains today, here in America and around the world, there are dozens of labs carrying out gain-of-function research with no agreed rules for safety, transparency, oversight. And in the words of the Times article, gain-of-function work is an international research network whose biggest center of gravity in terms of prestige, research direction and funding is the United States and the NIH. Exactly. We have the opportunity and the responsibility to do all we can to make sure this doesn't happen again. The first step is accountability for what happened before. Tell us what you think on the new free Twitter at NextRevFNC and at Steve Hilton X, and share this message when we post it.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.